Where do we go from here, chaos or community? I think a lot of people are asking this question. I know many of you in this room are asking this question and figuring out ways to answer it. But it really it comes back to almost, where do we go from here? What do we do now? How do we respond in a time when it feels like so many things seem to be flying at us all the time? Right? That how do we respond in a time where almost every day, and my alarm is my phone, so I turn off the alarm and almost immediately get on the phone to see what has happened overnight with current administration, what has happened, what's going on, right? Yesterday, I wake up and read about all the deportations, the rounding up of folks that happened in the last week. A couple of days ago, it was about potential administration folks who are going to be serving in cabinet positions. It seems like there's a constant onslaught, to me at least, just speaking personally, these days. And I get the question a lot because of who we are and who my organization is. What do we do to respond? And so again, if you have thoughts on that, please share them as we go along too. What I'd offer before talking a little bit about Virginia organizing is some perspective that some of our members have given me. And I tell people all the time, I'm incredibly lucky to be able to wake up every day and go to work and work with groups of folks who are trying to figure things out on the local level. I can't help but be optimistic sometimes when I go into a room with folks in Lee County, right, who are trying to figure out how to reopen the hospital. A 3-year fight out there. A hospital closed largely because we didn't expand Medicaid. There were a lot of other issues. But I get to go out there and talk to them about what we're doing to try to get that hospital back open. I get to go on Thursday, right, to an event. We've had 12 of them around the state now around health care. And generally, in the past, when we were doing in 2010, we were doing some work to try to push for a really solid health care bill through the Congress. And we wanted things that went a lot further even than the Affordable Care Act ended up doing. But, at those actions, we would have 25 or 30, and that was a good event. And many folks know, down here especially, or in a lot of rural areas, we have chapters all over the state, 25 or 30 is a good showing of folks. We've done these, and without fail now, we have way overshot what we were anticipating going into the event. I had, I think, 30 solid yeses on Thursday morning. And then I started to see the snowfall, and I started to see the temperature drop, and I thought, okay, I'll understand if it's not quite 30. But we ended up with just about 100, a little under 100, who were out there from one point or another on Thursday afternoon. So I can't help but remain positive when I think that way, right? When people took time out of their day because this is something that directly affects them. And I also draw some inspiration from the fact that we've got folks all across the state who have also been in times that feel like this, or stay in times that feel like this, just by nature of who they are, what they look like, who they're in relationship with. And those are the folks that give me strength to say, like, look, this is a rough time right now nationally, but we've figured out on a local and state level how to figure out how to fight back on some of these things. And that's what I want to share about today a little bit. So I think a lot about, I feel hopeless sometimes now, but we had 10 years ago in Lee County, Virginia, we had 850 people show up to the Lee County Gymnasium because Oxycontin had just hit the community. Painkiller addiction was running rampant. People were scared because they had loved ones who were getting addicted. They had employers who were leaving because they couldn't get enough people to pass a drug screen. Those folks felt helpless, but figured out how to fight back. And I'm going to share that in a second. I draw inspiration from our member in Danville, who her son, young African-American family, he was in high school, maybe had just finished high school at the time, but we did a canvassing project where he had local folks knock on doors all around Danville just to ask, what issues are important to you? I draw inspiration from the hopelessness she felt, and in turn what she did to respond to that, when we were sitting in the chief police office because one of his officers had used the N-word and yelled at this kid who sheer audacity in their mind to go knocking in the majority white, wealthier neighborhood in Danville. And so this guy is walking down the street, gets yelled at and harassed by the police, sat there with him and his mother as we tried to figure out how to respond to a system where that was just one symptom of what they felt like they dealt with every day. I draw inspiration from our members in Harrisonburg. We did 5 or 6 years ago. Harrisonburg is roughly between 30 and 40% Latino and Latina population. Back then, the police chief had entered with a 287G agreement with the ICE immigration enforcement folks where people were getting picked up for having a blinker that didn't work or having a bad tail light. And the police department there had agreed with ICE that they would hold people indefinitely and then until they were figuring out if they would deport them or not. And so that ended up 287G agreements were optional, and our folks worked on a campaign in response to that when they could have also been and were in many ways really hopeless. And the last couple things I'll mention is, we have folks in Portsmouth, parents who go to school or have their kids go to school every day, knowing that Virginia is the dead last across the country when it comes to diverting students of color into the criminal justice system. We send more students of color there than any other state. Percentage-wise. And so at Portsmouth, there were 2,200 suspensions last year. There are not that many students, throughout the Portsmouth system. Many of those were repeat offenses, but in a system where those parents get up every day and send their kids to school, I know that the hopelessness I can feel now can draw some hope and inspiration from what they do. And the last thing I'll mention is I've got a coworker, Harold, who made a mistake 25 years ago and went to jail, served time for it. I met him in 2001 because he had not had his rights to vote restored. And he had applied when he got out of incarceration. And we live in a state where restoration of rights is not an automatic thing. Harold worked for years with us, has become an organizer now, has lots of folks he knows in his community who have not had their rights restored. But Harold helped us figure out not only a restoration rights campaign, but also a way to do work on banning the box. So on employment applications where they have you convicted or serve time, did work up in Charlottesville to get that banned. So I say that just to frame today, a lot of what I'm talking about when I talk about activism, organizing, mobilizing, and advocacy, I know we need all parts of it, but I feel like where we're coming from it is definitely on the organizing side, and that's what I wanted to share. So I'm kind of setting the table. Are there any questions, concerns? Am I rambling too much? You can always do that. My kids have no problem telling me when I'm rambling. I wish they were here. They'd check. So I'm going to use this for a second, so I'll grab the mic. I carry this easel around all the time. Oh,
it's on.
Red light on.
The red light's on. Oh.
It's on.
How's that? Okay, great. Thank you, Harry. So let's see if I can get this over here. I carry this easel everywhere. I've actually run over it twice, and yet it still stands by me. So we'll see. That is not what I thought it was. Let me get to this next point. We think about 4 major ways to go about improving a community. And this is not an exhaustive list, but this is just how our organization sees itself. Usually I write these as I go, but since I just did this last week and I thought I'd recycle. So when we think about going about changing local communities, like I mentioned, we think of 4 main things, and certainly we could add some things here. But one thing we think about is direct service. And I think a lot of people I run across, some of their first interaction or thought about how do I improve my community comes out of direct service. And it is also essential, right, because we do a lot of work that requires meetings, that requires trying to build power. None of that's going to happen if my member is worried about how she's going to put food on the table that night. Or if I have a member who's worried about, this winter it hasn't been as bad, but when the weather turns cold and heating bills go up, and do I have to choose between pain medication or prescriptions or the heating bill. So direct service is one way to go about improving a community. Here I often talk about Paige, who worked for a housing group for years, right? I think a lot of people can think about the direct service, Habitat for Humanity, 60 non-perishable items you all collected last week. That falls into this line and is pretty straightforward. The second way we think about an organization or a group of folks can come together to improve their community is around education. And in my experience, I think generally about this there are groups that do specific work around education. So I use the example a lot. We did a tax reform campaign years ago where my eyes glazed over when I heard the word taxes. All I knew was like April 15th. I didn't think much about what that all meant, where my money was going. But there were organizations that helped us figure out a workshop, 45 minutes long, called Who Pays and Who Benefits, that broke down the Virginia state budget, basically. And our goal was then to use that information and get it into the hands of local folks, regular folks whose eyes also glazed over when they thought about taxes, right? So we couldn't have done our work if there weren't groups out there. Sometimes they're called think tanks, but, Center for Budget and Policy Priority, Economic Policy Institute, there are groups out there that their main job is thinking about information and can improve local communities. The third thing we think about generally is around advocacy. And I also use my daughters often when I talk about this, but we think about advocacy in terms of speaking on behalf of someone else. So if folks are kind of familiar with that concept, right, and sometimes it's really, really needed. If we've got somebody in a mental health crisis, they may not be able or willing at that point to go in and talk to a decision maker who's about to take a vote that might cut mental health funding. But there are groups out there that do that, right? There are professionals, community service boards that will go and speak on behalf of people who may not be able to otherwise. I use my daughters, and I often say, they probably wouldn't be, and I laugh because I think this may not be the case anymore, but they may not be the best advocates of the need for good funding for public schools. They're 8 and 10. They don't totally get how schools are funded. They know if their class has 20 kids versus 15 kids maybe. But generally, there are groups out there like the Virginia Education Association and other organizations that talk about how important it is to have good funding for public schools. But the last thing, and where I see our organization in terms of improving local communities, is really talking about direct action organizing. And what we do is mainly really work hard to try to figure out how to work to make sure that folks who are most directly affected by issues are the ones who are making the decisions and calling the shots of the organization. So we have a very specific, and I'll talk about it in a second too, analysis, a power analysis in the state that people traditionally, whether it's intentional in some cases, not in others, but left out of the decision-making process. And our organization really works hard to be deliberate about engaging those folks in the organization. So, for example, and a lot of what I'll do for the rest of my time is share a couple of stories. We did a payday lending campaign. Are folks familiar with like the predatory, what we call them predatory lending, payday lending places, check into cash? You often find them in predominantly low-income neighborhoods, partially because by our power analysis, and it's backed up by some stats, right? Banks don't work in lower-income neighborhoods at the same way they work in wealthier neighborhoods, right? There are less branches, there are less ATM machines. Come to find out, several of the big banks were funding some of these payday loan places. But payday loans are something that at the same time is needed. We've got a lot of members who get paid, once every 2 weeks, and it's not enough to stretch that whole 2 weeks. So they need a way to get money fast. What was happening is lenders were charging 400, 300, 400% interest. Right? You couldn't get out from under them. And so there was a whole group of organizations that had done research on the state of Virginia and nationally what was going on around payday loans. We had advocacy groups that were working hard on, about this was maybe 5 or 6 years ago. The federal government had recently said that you can't charge over 36% interest to active military. So there was some work being done on certain pieces of the problem. But our approach to that issue was bringing in folks who had payday loans, right? So instead of talking on behalf of someone with a loan, we went out and found people who had 3 and 4 of these things. And I haven't been in more powerful meetings than a meeting with then Senator Philip Puckett, who was just north of here, who went in, and we had one of our members, a guy named Bill. We went up to Richmond with a carload of people, and we got there to Senator Puckett's office. There were 4 or 5 guys in suits outside, and at the time the payday lending industry had, behind Dominion Resources, had the second most paid lobbyists at the Virginia Capitol. So they were sitting there waiting. Many of them, they were all payday lending industry folks. They were in line ahead of us, but Senator Puckett came out and brought us in. One, because he said, hey, you all are local folks. I know you from home. And then when we get in there, and he had been he had been close to the vest on how he's going to vote. And certainly this wasn't the only thing I don't think that swayed him. But we went in there and Bill was able to say, Senator Puckett, look, you may not know me personally, but you know my family and you know people like me. I'm from Russell County. I've got 3 of these things out right now. and I'm working 2 jobs to try to pay them, and I just can't get out from under them. And so Bill, in that one meeting, did much more powerful work on his own behalf than I think we could have ever done if we just walked in with all the best numbers in the world. So does that kind of make sense in terms of where we see ourselves organizing-wise, and how I do really believe, especially in a time like now, but at all times, in my experience, we need all of these. We've got to all be working on some level or another, but that our group's role is really feeling like getting directly affected people involved has to happen. And the last thing I'll mention is that we, generally when I write this up, and why I write it sideways when I'm doing an organizing workshop, we had 60 people out in Blacksburg last Saturday who sat for 8 hours, listened to the organizers and members talk about this. So that's what this is from. But generally, we think about it on a spectrum. And this end tends to accept the current power relationships, and this end tends to challenge existing power relationships. So not only do we get directly affected people involved, but we do a lot of work around power and being deliberate about naming who has power in our organization. So the last thing I'll mention before sharing a couple of stories, which I think are hopefully more informative than all this even, we do 3 main things when we're organizing. And the first of those is to try to win. We're trying to win real concrete improvement in people's lives. We're trying to, for example, keep an Affordable Care Act that, while not perfect, is covering more people than were covered before it was passed. We're trying to get the county to adopt a resolution or an ordinance that says we won't allow hydrofracking, right? We're trying to win concrete wins when we organize, because, we're not going to win even a majority of the time, but if we're never winning, people are going to start to wonder, like, what's it worth? So that's one thing we're trying to do when we organize. The second thing is to work with people to get a sense, and I'm a terrible speller, of their, is that right? Looking at my English major wife, own power. And so there are lots of groups out there trying to win. Where I would say that we try to really focus on as well is to not only win, but to do it in a way where people realize, hey, we've got some power. We didn't feel like we did before, but we do now. One way we did that in Lee County, and if you've heard me talk, you've probably heard me talk about our Lee County chapter before. They were our very first chapter, and we were really deliberate about being outside of Richmond. There were a lot of groups that were Richmond out. We wanted to be in places that have been traditionally left out of the decision-making process. So Lee County is closer to like 7 or 8 other state capitals. It really does feel, we had, some of our first board members saying Virginia doesn't end at Roanoke. People talking about far southwest Virginia being Roanoke and not remembering the 4 hours past that, right? So we were very deliberate about going out to Lee County. But not only that, our chapter there and our base for our work is one-to-one conversations. We just go out and talk to people about what issues are important to them. So in that, we're hearing lots of different issues at the time. But on top of just doing the conversations, we try to make sure we're as diverse as possible. So we went and we made sure that we found folks who were part of the African American community. We found folks from different ages and classes. But the African American folks out there, it's less than 300 people in a county of, I think at the time, roughly 16,000. But they had been there for a really long time. And it came down to this group. We do all these conversations, and we start talking about what issues are important to people. So the group in Lee County came down to 2 things. One was fighting a proposed landfill that was looking to be built in the western part of the county. The other, though, was the fact that the African American folks in the room, while small in number, said, hey, we've never had a person of color on a jury in Lee County. And this is in late 90s, right? This isn't 50s or 60s. This is very real continuation of massive resistance in Virginia. So the chapter there said, well, let's work on that. At the same time, we thought, we could probably call Channel 5 and get this changed like next week. If we just had somebody come out and we said, look, they're not doing random selection. But instead, the group said, let's go about and kind of research and figure out why this is, who's making the decision. Found out there was 3 kind of the old power players in the county. Every county's got those last names. So there were 3 of them, the power folks in Lee County, who were choosing the jury pools. So they weren't choosing every 12-person jury, but they were choosing who got called, right? The list of people who got called. And we got a hold of that, and we spent some time to let the community know that we got a hold of that list. And turns out very quickly, if anybody's paying attention who lives in these zip codes, they were leaving out the parts of the county where traditionally low-income folks live and where African-American folks live. So instead of random selection, they were really leaving folks out. So that's when we decided to go ahead and move forward on the campaign. So instead of working to try to get something changed that we could have done immediately and quickly, probably, we took maybe 3 or 4 more months, but really built a chapter of folks who all knew when we won, they knew why. They knew it was because regular people spoke up, and now we've got random selection in Lee County. So that's an example of working with folks to get a sense of their own power. The thought that we've all got some sort of power in us, but it's a matter of trying to figure out, especially with people who've been kicked around and told they don't have the opportunity to be involved, how do we involve them? The last thing we try to do when we organize is to alter relationships of power. And so this, when I talk about this, is generally pushing back on this idea of the good old boy network or the Virginia way. We've heard it talked about a lot, right? But the thought that those in power are the ones who are always going to be in power. We try to organize in a way that says, actually, power is not a zero-sum game, and that we feel like people who have traditionally had power in the past can get a chance to get it and should. So that's what we do at Virginia Organizing. I was going to also show just generally, and I've got all kinds of books and brochures, but we've got chapters all across the state of Virginia. And what we're trying to do is figure out ways on a day-to-day basis to, one, hear what issues are important to people, and then two, if people want to do it, how do we come together and work for change? And so I'll wrap up kind of with a couple of those stories that I mentioned earlier. Is that good? I'm glad that didn't just make a huge noise. Yes, I'm sorry. I should have orchestrated this better. I'm not used to having raised platforms, so. But generally, you know, I talked about what do we do now, and this is in no way to minimize the huge challenges a lot of our communities face now. This is just to highlight that a lot of those communities, and some that we're involved in, have faced these challenges before, or similar ones, and figured out how to make something work. So I mentioned Lee County, and in 2004, having 850 people show up because people were literally scared to death about this huge epidemic. We did a bunch of one-to-ones in Lee County, and folks started talking about, you know, we can think of some things that might help. Nothing was going to be the magical answer to the fact that all of a sudden you had all these painkillers into the community. But we listed 10 things that we thought would improve the situation. And that was done in rooms just like this, where we had people get in small group. We said, what would help you, you know, if your uncle is in jail right now, or is it your kids are worried to death in school every day? You know, what are some of the things that would help you? And we came down on 2 main things in that chapter. One was around the fact that Purdue Pharma, who was making OxyContin, had a big federal case that happened to be heard in Abingdon. And so this was the big drug company. We said, let's with the idea of giving people a sense of their own power, let's have a big rally where people just share their stories of drug addiction. And we found a bunch of people who were willing to do that. We had people coming in from all over the country because this was a national or a federal case. And we had a big gathering in the park. They used to have the big in Abingdon gazebo, kind of now where the mural is, and they don't have that anymore. But we had people sharing from the gazebo, and the park was close to full, hearing about stories of addiction. Then we had people go into the courtroom and sit in the gallery while the case was actually being heard. And I was there the day when the guy pulls out the map. He was a former Purdue Pharma employee, and he said, my job was to find where 2 things were going on. One, where people were chronically in pain, and 2, where they were medically underserved communities. And so he said, so I pulled out a map like this, and I found Maine, and I found Central Appalachia. And Maine had a bunch of folks in the logging industry and other industries that were chronically in pain, and Central Appalachia, of course, lots of folks in industry related to coal mining. But he basically, in court, was saying, my job was to figure out where we could get our product into the community in a way where we could just inundate it. So that case came about. We had people all in the courtroom. They ended up settling for at the time, the second largest settlement was like almost $400 million, where they said we misrepresented our product, and we We lied about the addictiveness of it, basically. So we did that in a way where people in the room felt some sense of, wow, this doesn't change things, but we got $400 million almost to try to figure out how to offset some of the ramifications of drug abuse. The other thing we did after that was look at drug courts. And are folks familiar with drug courts? Kind of they're like a special use court. Basically, they often work, and they started in more urban areas, but the idea that if you're a first-time offender and you have the ability and the willingness, you can go into a program that's more rehab-based and keeps you out of jail. And when we started that campaign in Southwest Virginia, Tazewell County was the only one who had started it. And we were hearing all the time that this is soft on crime. I had Delegate Kilgore, who's from a little bit west of here, said this is a hug-a-thug program, very against drug courts. What we did is build some power, build some relationships with folks across the board, spent a couple of years on a campaign saying, actually, this is how we think it might work well in rural parts of the state. We ended up building some relationships with county administrators who said, look, we're spending $30,000 a year every time we send somebody to the Washington County Regional Jail, on average. That's how much it costs to lock somebody up. We got to do this a different way. So we ended up, and comes full circle. Delegate Kilgore was one of the key votes on it, but we ended up getting drug courts established in every county west of 81 out here. And again, this wasn't just Virginia organizing. None of this is done in a silo, but it was with a lot of groups working on the issue, trying to figure out how our piece of it was bringing people who had been addicted or had loved ones who were addicted who could speak to what they needed to see done. I'll wrap up. I think I'm about the end of my time, and I'd love to hear questions if you've got them. I've got several stories I can tell. I guess on the Danville one, so that was the very first time in Danville that we had any folks doing anything local. And this is where the mother was in the room with the police chief, and he had called her son the N-word, or his officer had. We had never done much work in Danville at the time. And Danville has, folks are familiar, it's got huge unemployment rates. It used to be a textile and used to be furniture making, tobacco processing. They all left. So a lot of work done down there. We figured out how to talk about jobs, but we also did it in a way where we were leading with issues around race. And so we did a bunch of research, did a bunch of canvassing. They did a campaign on a local jobs program that would hire and make sure that there's an emphasis placed on hiring contractors of color or minority contractors, because we found that they were one of the worst in the state at who they hired along those lines. That chapter then went on to work on several different issues. They were there when a couple years ago a coal ash spill happened in the Dan River, and none of the statewide groups had anybody in Danville because a lot of their model has been be in Richmond and kind of get out here when they need to. But since we had a chapter there, they approached us, and our folks said, sure, we can work on coal ash, but we're going to do it in our way. And we had several people write letters to the editor about growing up, and these are African-American folks who probably didn't, going into it, think of themselves as environmentalists, but they brought their stories around, hey, we fished in that river. Growing up, that's where we got our dinner from. And this is why it's important to me that there are better regulations that, I think it was Duke Energy whose coal ash pond had spilled into the river, be held accountable for that. Right? And then to today, because we've got a multi-issue chapter there, or diverse in every way, we've got a chapter of folks who have built some power where now when an issue comes up in Danville, they think about, what is Virginia Organizing going to think about on this? The latest example is that was over the summer, the police chief there, who we've spent a long time trying to build a relationship with, who went from denying that racial profiling occurred in his department to sitting down with us and reaching out to us because they got in the national news because whenever a squad car would pull up, they would lift the hood. And they said it was because the engines would overheat. But our members of color were saying, a squad car is pulling up. We know they're cameras because we helped fight to try to get cameras in their dashboards, but they're lifting the hood. And so you'd have these pictures, and I think Sean King or some folks who do national work got a hold of these pictures of squad cars with their hoods up. The police chief came to us to say, I've got a huge problem on my hands. Is there a way that this chapter can help me figure this out? And again, it wasn't only us, but we played a big role in making sure that people of color there were telling him, this is why that's a problem, and at the very least, when you're doing some sort of thing like this, you should think about or ask us, like, how does this look? And so that's the level of power they've built there. So I guess I say that all to say, where do we go from here? Our response to what we are locally, or where we are nationally right now, has been three main things. One is to support vulnerable communities. And so we've done a lot of work. We've researched with attorneys. In the state of Virginia, there's no such thing as a sanctuary city because of the way our state law is set up. But there hasn't been a case where law enforcement have come into anywhere and kind of busted down the doors of a house of worship or institution. So we're doing research to try to connect law enforcement, universities, local religious congregations to ways that they might offer sanctuary to people who are afraid of being raided or have deported. Does that make sense? I kind of tripped over that. But this idea of sanctuary cities, we're trying to do a lot of work to be there for vulnerable communities. We're also working with APEC, for example. This Thursday, we're going to meet with some folks who are going to go down and meet with the chief of police and ask questions about currently we're a group of concerned citizens here in Abingdon. We did this a week ago with the Sheriff Newman. What are your policies right now around if you have an officer come upon somebody in mental health crisis? Or if you have an officer, are you all agreeing with ICE right now? Are you holding anybody for deportations? We're just asking the questions, and we're doing that in places all over the states. That's one thing we've said that we can do is try to support folks who are the most vulnerable. We also just won a campaign a couple of years ago along these lines that helped us build some relationships up in Roanoke with Carillion, where we had several transgender folks come to us and say, I can't get health care anywhere in this entire region and feel safe about it. Because even the medical professionals in a lot of these offices are completely harassing. Carillion got out in front of that, and we went and took a group of folks who shared their stories, and they said, okay, we're going to set up a specific clinic, we're going to have a specific number that people can call, and that's helped us build a relationship with folks in the New River Valley around GLBTQ issues, where we're trying to do the same thing. How can we offer support to communities that feel really vulnerable right now? The second thing we're doing is fighting back in a positive way, and healthcare is the main one we're doing that right now. So as Bunny mentioned, we had 100 people out on Thursday. We had 50 people in Christiansburg at Congressman Griffith's office. We had 30 people go to his office in Martinsville. And we're not just doing this in his district, we're doing it all over the state. But we found that people feel better when they're moving. And so even if it's kind of a, something that may seem really overwhelming, even if it's something that we may not have the greatest chance of winning on, people feel great. It was great to be out there with a bunch of other people on Thursday realizing that you're not alone. So we're doing a lot of work on fighting back around health care. The last thing, and this is what I'll shut up after this, but the last thing we're doing falls in line a lot with what Dr. King said in this book. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. I think it was the last book he wrote. It was in 1967. It's called Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? And he speaks to a lot of where we are right now. At least to me, it spoke a lot to that. But one thing he mentions is that we really need a planned, organized, and orderly march that's really thinking about power as we're organizing. And he critiques a little bit about, we did a lot of great work around mass movements. We had marches. We had a bunch of events going on. But we weren't doing the organizing and the power analysis part sometimes. And that's where he felt like in 1967 when he was writing that the movement needed to go. And to that point, that's where what we're trying to do. We're trying to develop leaders in chapters. We've got 3 or 4 new chapters that are getting ready to come online this year. We've got campaigns around fighting racism, fighting discrimination on sexual orientation, fighting discrimination against immigrants. We're trying to lead with campaigns on the local and state level that help us build power in a way that answers, what do we do right now? So I rambled a bit. I hope that was useful. I do have lots of brochures. Also, I'm lucky. My job is to talk to folks. So if you heard anything at all today, if it's somebody I haven't connected with in a while or somebody I've never connected with, I'd love to hear your thoughts on all of this. And again, thanks for listening.